Hello, my name is Dr. Samuel Wheeler, and I am the State Historian of Illinois. And welcome to the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Museum. We are glad to have you here today. Behind me, you can see the Lincoln family. And if you look around, you can also see a log cabin, not unlike the one Abraham Lincoln grew up in. Behind me, you can also see the White House. That's where he ended his life as President of the United States, one of the most powerful men in the world. He lived the American dream. And so throughout our museum, you're going to get to know Abraham Lincoln a little bit. You're going to meet the members of his family, and you're going to become familiar with the challenges that confronted Abraham Lincoln. And we hope you'll get a good understanding of why Abraham Lincoln is one of the most significant figures, not just in American history, but in world history. He saved the Union. American slavery died on his watch, and he left us with an amazing legacy that we're so happy to preserve here at the museum. In this scene here, we have two important figures from the American Civil War era, Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth. Two African Americans, two former slaves, but individuals that Abraham Lincoln had met during the White House years. Sojourner Truth, an important female figure that goes on to become an important figure in the abolitionist movement. And of course, Frederick Douglass, a powerful orator, an amazing writer. Abraham Lincoln met him during the Civil War. Douglass had a personal relationship with Abraham Lincoln. Goes on to see what a significant figure Abraham Lincoln was in the abolitionist movement and ultimately the eradication of American slavery, and Mr. Lincoln grew to deeply respect Frederick Douglass. They were probably the first African Americans that were received so warmly by a President of the United States. Well, on the porch, we also have two generals that made a significant impact on the American Civil War. We have General George McClellan and we have General Ulysses S. Grant. They had very different histories in the war. General McClellan is the general Mr. Lincoln goes to first to win this war. A young guy, a West Point graduate, very educated, very ambitious, very popular with the soldiers. But at the beginning of the war, he's fighting a traditional war, and he is reluctant to have, maybe we'll say, too much bloodshed in this war. Now, General McClellan ultimately is let go by Abraham Lincoln because he's too slow. He's not aggressive enough. He's not willing to commit all of his troops to battle. In 1864, General McClellan actually runs for president against Abraham Lincoln, against his old boss. He's defeated, of course. Around the same time, Abraham Lincoln finds a new general. That new general is Ulysses S. Grant. Grant, as you can see by his clothes, his demeanor, he's a different general than McClellan. He has understood that this is going to be a hard war, that this is not going to be a war won with traditional means. And he also comes to understand what he calls that awful arithmetic. The Union soldiers far outnumber the Confederate soldiers. As long as there's battles and as long as we're trading casualties one for one, the Union will win by an awful war of attrition. The press ends up nicknaming him Grant the Butcher, but ultimately Lincoln, along with Grant, finds success, and that brings us to a Union victory in the Civil War. Well, welcome to the Blue Room in the White House, and we see Mary Lincoln getting ready for a ball at the White House. Her dressmaker, Elizabeth Keckley, is helping her get ready. She's right behind her. And behind Mary, you can see several different dresses. Those are not Mary's dresses. Those are the dresses of her rivals. There's a society going on in Washington, and one of the duties of the First Lady is to be something of a hostess, to be an entertainer. And the Lincolns, when they came to the White House, Abraham Lincoln was the first president to be elected who came from this far west. They were viewed with some skepticism, some doubts about are they really sophisticated people or not. It was not easy for the Lincolns to adjust to life in Washington, and Mary had a particularly hard time about it. These rivals really gave her some issues, as well as the press. As the war started, Mary Lincoln is viewed skeptically by both sides. She's a Southerner. She's born in Kentucky. That's where her family lives, but yet she's married to the President of the United States, who's waging war on the Confederacy. And then also the Northerners viewed her with suspicion. She had stepbrothers and brothers who were fighting for the Confederacy. Mary was a sophisticated, really educated individual. Being a hostess, trying to prove her doubters wrong was something that Mary was very interested in doing.
What's that man doing as our country burns? He jokes. This disgusting fool is just like Nero or any of those other tyrants.
This is a very disorienting hallway in our museum, and it was designed to be so.
The man's worse than Caesar himself.
It is filled with political cartoons that were very negative about Abraham Lincoln that appeared during Mr. Lincoln's lifetime.
If you ask me, Mrs. Lincoln has brought shame upon the president's house because she is so selfish. She spends money on herself, but is cheap with the help.
Today, we think of Mr. Lincoln as one of the most popular people that have ever lived. He must have had a fabulous life, right? Well, it's not the case. He also had very harsh critics of his presidency. These political cartoons that you see on the wall, they come from not just newspapers in the Confederacy, but also newspapers from around the world, and also newspapers from throughout the North. In addition to all of his critics, he also had critics in the North. The Democrats were constantly trying to unseat him and to hinder his policies. And so this hallway, the disorienting aspect, gives you an insight into how disorienting it must have been to be President of the United States during a civil war. Now, an important point to recognize is despite these harsh critics, these terrible, oftentimes unfair critiques that were really below the belt, think about this. Number one, dirty politics, it's not unique to our time in the 21st century. It existed back in Abraham Lincoln's time. And second, despite these harsh criticisms, Abraham Lincoln stood firm. In early 1862, both the Lincoln children became desperately ill. Willie and Tad began to show some troubling symptoms, high fevers, body aches, felt horrible. What had happened, they drank water that was tainted, that had been pumped in directly from the Potomac River. They probably knew they weren't supposed to drink it. They were supposed to just wash up with it. But little boys being who they are, they probably drank that tainted water. And Willie and Tad both became desperately ill with typhoid fever. Tad recovered, but his big brother Willie did not. Willie passed away in February of 1862, devastated, his mom and dad and his brothers, Robert and Tad. And so for the rest of the White House years, Tad really was his father's constant companion. His father became his playmate because he didn't have Willie. And Mr. Lincoln, because he had lost his son, really cherished that relationship with his little boy Tad. And so you get all sorts of awesome stories that Tad would sometimes disrupt cabinet meetings, like this scene right here where Abraham Lincoln is meeting with the members of his cabinet. They're discussing some of the most momentous issues that would take place during the American Civil War, specifically what to do about American slavery. Slavery still existed at the midway point through the war, and in 1862, Abraham Lincoln decided to issue the Emancipation Proclamation.
Emancipation? Freedom? Oh, Mr. Lincoln's gonna set our brothers and sisters free. He doesn't even need Congress. He's gonna issue a proclamation.
Pay no attention to what you hear in this house. Believe what they do, not what they say.
To issue a proclamation that would free those slaves that were in states that were still under rebellion. And when Union armies would move through those areas, thousands of slaves would flock to the safety of Union lines and then would be sent further to the north. A controversial measure that Lincoln did not make lightly, but took the advice, the consultation of members of his cabinet, as well as concerned citizens and politicians from not just the North. He also heard from folks in the South as well as folks overseas. ultimately issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, and by war's end, of course, the 13th Amendment would be passed, 4 million slaves would be free, and the 250-year-old institution of American slavery would be ended once and for all. The final version of the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect on January 1st, 1863. It provided a provision in there for having African Americans serve as soldiers for the Union Army. All told, more than 190,000 African Americans fought for the Union. 75% of those soldiers were former slaves. Mr. Lincoln had deprived the Confederacy of an important labor element in the slaves, and he had provided the Union with an excellent fighting force. The American Civil War is known for its brutality. More than 620,000 casualties took place during the American Civil War. That's both North and South. Those are folks that left home, volunteered to fight, sometimes were drafted to fight, and never came home. In the Civil War in 1865, what did it mean for America to lose 620,000 folks? It meant that 2% of the population died. Now today, if America was to have a war in which 2% of our population wouldn't make it back home, that means that about 6 or 7 million casualties would take place. That's how devastating the physical cost of the war was. Now in this room, we have the scene of the Gettysburg, the Battle of Gettysburg, the most famous, the most iconic, the bloodiest battle of the American Civil War. North and South fought for 3 days, and at the end of those 3 days, the North prevails. The Union has a victory at Gettysburg. More than 7,000 individuals lost their lives during that battle. They decided to create a national cemetery on the battlefield where they could bury the casualties from the battle. The battle took place in July. By November, the cemetery is complete. They have a ceremony that they're going to dedicate the cemetery, and they invite Abraham Lincoln. That's the moment in which Abraham Lincoln gives probably the most popular speech in human history, the Gettysburg Address. It's just 272 words, but in that speech, Abraham Lincoln is talking to the Union. He's talking to folks about how important it is to see this war through to its end, how important it is for the Union to prevail, because if that were the case, then democracy would prevail. One of our final scenes in the museum, as you might imagine, is Ford's Theater. On April 9th, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered his army to Ulysses S. Grant. It signifies the virtual end of the American Civil War. Everyone throughout the North they're very excited. Abraham Lincoln is thrilled that the end of this horrible conflict is finally near. 5 days after the virtual end of the American Civil War, Abraham Lincoln and his wife decide to go to the theater. They want to see a play. They decide to see a play called Our American Cousin because they wanted to laugh that night. And about 10:15 in the evening, as they're watching the play, as the actor delivers the funniest line in the play and the audience is laughing, a well-known actor sneaks into the presidential box and brutally murders Abraham Lincoln. Just 5 days after the end of the American Civil War, Shakespeare himself would be hard-pressed to write a more dramatic, tragic ending to the American Civil War and Mr. Lincoln's life. Now, Abraham Lincoln immediately becomes a martyr in American history, rises to the level of American sainthood. His funeral takes place in cities all across the United States, from Washington to Springfield. Today, Abraham Lincoln is considered one of the most important individuals in American history and world history. We've just scratched the surface here during our brief tour. Come visit us here in Springfield, Illinois at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Museum, where you'll see everything that I've showed you, but a lot more, including more than 100 artifacts that are on display every day here in our museum, as well as 2 shows, that you'll see, 2 really dramatic, interactive theater experiences, and so much more. Thank you.